Katy Butler has written her first book,
Yes.
Knocking on Heaven's Doors, the name, the path to a better way of death. Katy Butler, who was Jeffrey Butler?
Well, Jeffrey Butler was my father, and you're holding up a picture of him and me in a very loving position. He was a World War II veteran. He lost his arm in the war. He had amazing guts. He built floor-to-ceiling bookcases for our living room with only one arm, which was just amazing. And he was a professor of history. And
Where did he teach?
he taught at Wesleyan University in Connecticut, and he lived a very long, full, happy, and vigorous life.
What were the last couple of years of his life like?
When he was 79, he had a devastating stroke, but he didn't die until he was 85, at a time when actually his death would have been a mercy and a blessing, because he was given a pacemaker a year after this devastating stroke, and the result was, frankly, that his heart kept going while he descended into dementia and near blindness and misery, and actually said to my mother, "I'm living too long." So those last 5 years of his life were, frankly, terrible.
When the pacemaker was put in at age 80, what was the family's thought about that?
I think it was a combination of ignorance and denial. There was no real conversation with the doctor about whether or not to do it, or what the long-term implications of doing this would be, or the moral implications, or what my father's choices were. Essentially, the doctor just said, he has a slow heartbeat, so we're putting in a pacemaker. And the result was that my mother, I talked to her about it quite a bit later, and she said, I was still in denial. I still had hope that somehow he could recover from the stroke. And I was the daughter on the far coast and quite ignorant about medicine then, and I really figured it was their decision, it was up to them. If I had it to do over again, though, I think I would have been a lot more proactive at that early stage. I would have done a lot more research. I would have understood better what we were up against. Yeah.
If you had chosen to take out the pacemaker after 2 years, could you do that?
Well, it's an interesting question. First of all, it wouldn't have had to been taken out. It could actually be disabled with just a little remote radio device that would deactivate it. So it was actually a painless procedure. And the cardiologist associations have now put out a statement saying that it is not euthanasia, it's not assisted suicide, it's perfectly moral and legal to have a pacemaker disabled. Unfortunately, that statement came very, very late in the process for us. So I think it's an area where medicine is still kind of groping for answers and doesn't really know how to even discuss these questions. And maybe we as a culture, we're just not, we don't really know how to do it yet, you know?
Katy Butler, what did your parents, both your mom and your dad died, what did the end of their life care cost?
It's a very interesting question. Neither of them had highly expensive deaths. If you look at my father's last 5 or 6 years of life, you get to probably about $80,000 worth of pacemaker, that kind of stuff. My mother, on the other hand, very close to the end of her life, refused open heart surgery. And then she had a heart attack, and the doctors again said, let's do open heart surgery.
How old was she?
She was 84 at that point. And if we had done the surgeries they recommended, it would have cost Medicare $80,000 to $150,000. But she declined all that. And so her death was, I would say it was probably a $10,000 or $20,000 death, because she was in hospice. She declined most extraordinary intervention. And so we got a lot of social work, a lot of healing, a lot of reassurance from a medical team, but we didn't get high-tech, expensive, futile, painful interventions that so many people suffer.
Are there people who choose all methods possible to
Yes.
sustain life?
Yes.
Why?
I think there's a couple reasons. One is that we just have to allow everyone their choice and their range of autonomy as they approach their own deaths. But I think the other reason is we have a terror and an ignorance of death now. Because up until 1900, people died randomly throughout the lifespan, and they actually read books with titles like Ars Moriendi, The Art of Dying. They actually considered it part of their spiritual obligation to prepare themselves for their own deathbeds. So they were very good on the acceptance, bravery, and courage that it takes to die, to face your death head on. And we really lost all that in the 1950s and 60s when we became so adept at life-saving and life-prolonging.
Has death become an industry?
Wow, what a question. It's medicine has become an industry. And high-tech fixes, however expensive they are, can be very, very appropriate, especially in early stages of life. We really can save people who would have died 100 years ago. But towards the end of life, it's actually, unfortunately, we've structured our medical system so it's actually profitable for a hospital or a device manufacturer to put a device in someone for whom it's totally inappropriate, or to prolong a death in an ICU in a way that's totally inappropriate for that particular person.
As medical techniques advance and advance and advance, at what point does a heart, lungs, at what point does that constitute life?
Well, I think that's a really good question. And again, before the 1950s, you couldn't preserve one organ. You couldn't make a heart keep going without the rest of the body functioning. And now we can keep any single organ functioning, or several of them at once, when the person has no brain, perhaps no sense of self, perhaps the soul has already fled the body. And yet we're so fixated on the idea that pink skin and a heart beating is in fact life. And I think, unfortunately, we don't have language to discuss this, and we have put simple maximum longevity on an altar instead of worshiping true love, true relationships, the importance of bravery and spiritual acceptance towards the end of life, so that people can have meaningful deaths that don't leave their families traumatized.
In Knocking on Heaven's Door, you write, doctors are often insulted by the suggestion that such financial strictures help shape their medical treatment, but just as surely as the home mortgage deduction promotes home ownership, economic incentives and disincentives, along with discomfort with dying, fear of being sued or accused of conducting a death panel, and feelings of professional failure, encourage specialists to refer patients to hospice care only days before death.
It's sad but true. Half of the people who enter hospice are there for only the last 14 days of their life or less. And for example, an oncologist who suggests yet another round of futile chemotherapy will get 6% of the price tag of that chemo, even if it's a $10,000, $20,000 chemo. But if he has a 2-hour conversation with a family that's meaningful and deep and says, I think we're at the end of line for what chemo can do for you, and I want to refer you to hospice, he will get virtually nothing for that 2-hour conversation. So why are we creating pathways that actually reward doctors for doing the wrong thing in situations where they sometimes even know what the right thing is? Which is, it's not a knock on doctors, it's why do we put them in such an impossible position?
So, Katy Butler, when you've talked to doctors you know about this book, what's their reaction?
There are a whole range of reactions, from your mother was right and you two did the right thing, to saying, I don't understand, either I don't understand how medicine works, that's one line I get, but the other one is, you don't understand how afraid we are that a family is going to sue us for wrongful death. And that we don't know our patients. People come into the emergency room, we've never seen them before. We don't know if it's a Katy Butler family with a DNR and a very clear living will, or someone who's going to say, my father's 95, but I've never ever discussed the end of his life with him, and I want you to keep him alive no matter what. So I think I came to understand, as I wrote the book, what a difficult position that they're in. There's actually a phrase in hospitals called the nephew from Peoria. And this is the relative who flies in, long distance, who has been not involved at all in the family care, and now insists that everything be done to prolong the life. Even if the family member who's dying has a living will and has said very clearly that they don't want extraordinary measures. So I think I have a lot more compassion now for what the difficult position we've put them in. Yeah.
Changes in Medicare's reimbursement structure could help.
Yeah.
Perhaps someday